Sophia Miller was never one to believe in the supernatural. Rational and pragmatic, she had always considered ghost stories and paranormal phenomena to be nothing more than old wives' tales and overactive imaginations. But when she inherited her grandmother's house in the quiet town of Ravenbrook, a place she had visited only a handful of times during her childhood, she couldn't ignore the eerie feeling that crept over her the moment she stepped through the front door. The house, located on the outskirts of town, was old, creaky floorboards, weathered walls, and a lingering musty smell. Sophia had heard stories of her grandmother's eccentricity, how she had lived alone for decades, avoiding visitors and speaking in hushed tones about things that most people dismissed as the ramblings of an aging mind. But the house was hers now, and it was time to settle in. The first few days were uneventful. She unpacked, cleaned, and slowly transformed the old place into a cozy home. Yet, there was an ever-present unease that tugged at the back of her mind. It wasn't until the third night that she began to experience something that couldn't be explained away by rational thought. The first incident, Sophia was lying in bed, reading a book, when she heard a faint scratching noise. At first, she thought it was the wind, but the sound grew more distinct, like fingernails scraping against wood. She froze, listening. The noise was coming from the walls, faint but constant. She set her book down and stood, walking cautiously towards the wall where the sound seemed to be emanating from. It was an old house, after all. "It's probably rats or old pipes," she muttered to herself, dismissing the thought of anything supernatural. But as she stood there, listening, the scratching stopped abruptly. Then, from the same spot, a deep, guttural whisper, soft, yet clear, echoed through the room. "Leave." Sophia's heart raced as she took a step back. Her breath caught in her throat, and she tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. But the chill in the room, the oppressive silence that followed the whisper, it was enough to send a shiver down her spine. Determined not to let fear control her, Sophia brushed it off as a momentary lapse in judgment. She turned off the light and went to bed, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The voices grew louder the next evening. After a long day of sorting through her grandmother's belongings, Sophia sat down to dinner in the kitchen. As she ate, she noticed the temperature in the room suddenly drop. Goosebumps rose on her skin, and she felt a strange heaviness in the air, like the house was closing in around her. That's when she heard it again, the same scratching, only louder this time, followed by a series of whispers. They were coming from the kitchen walls, echoing through the room with an eerie cadence. "Sophia, don't ignore us." She spun around, her pulse quickening. The room was empty, the only sound now being the relentless tapping of the walls. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, dialing the number of her best friend, Claire. But just as she pressed the call button, the lights flickered, and the whispers turned into frantic, indistinguishable voices, all overlapping each other. Sophia's phone screen turned to static before it shut off entirely. Fear began to creep into her mind, and she couldn't stop the racing thoughts that filled her head. The whispers had mentioned her name. How could it have known? Her grandmother had never spoken of anything like this, no ghosts, no spirits, nothing. Panicking, Sophia grabbed her keys and rushed out of the house, unable to shake the feeling that the walls themselves were closing in on her. She went to Claire's apartment, seeking comfort and a semblance of normalcy. But as she sat in Claire's living room, trying to calm her shaking hands, the thought nagged at her, what if I wasn't imagining it? The investigation the next morning, still rattled by the previous night's events, Sophia returned to the house, determined to get to the bottom of whatever was happening. She couldn't continue living in fear, especially if it meant losing the inheritance she had worked so hard for. She rummaged through her grandmother's old belongings, hoping to find some clue as to why the house felt wrong. Amidst dusty boxes and old furniture, she found a small leather-bound journal. It was filled with her grandmother's handwriting, chronicling years of strange occurrences, voices in the walls, items moved without explanation, and disturbing dreams. But the most unsettling entry was the last one, written just days before her grandmother's death. "They're here, they've always been here. I tried to leave, but they won't let me go. I can hear them in the walls. I hear their whispers. They want me to stay. They want me to join them." Sophia's stomach turned as she read those words. Her grandmother had been plagued by the same thing she was experiencing now. The scratching. The whispers. The feeling of being watched. That night, unable to sleep, Sophia decided to confront whatever haunted the house. Armed with a flashlight and the journal for guidance, she ventured into the attic, where her grandmother had written that the activity had been the strongest. The attic was cramped, filled with old furniture and cobwebs, but it was the perfect place to search for answers. As she moved through the dusty space, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The temperature had dropped again, the air thick and stagnant. Then, the scratching began, louder than ever before, coming from the walls beneath her feet. Her flashlight flickered, casting long shadows across the room. A voice, low and raspy, spoke in a whisper she could barely make out. "We've been waiting for you, Sophia." Her blood ran cold. She could feel something brush against her leg, but when she looked down, there was nothing there. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. As the light rolled away, casting the room into darkness, the whispers intensified, a chorus of voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize. Sophia fumbled for her phone, praying the flashlight function still worked. When she turned it on, she saw something that made her blood run cold, a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, its face hidden in the dark. It moved closer, its form shifting like smoke, a faint whisper echoing in her mind. "Leave, or join us." The revelation in that moment, Sophia realized that the house wasn't just haunted by spirits. It was a prison. The voices, the figures, the whispers, they were all trapped here, and now they wanted her to stay with them forever. The figure reached out, its hand cold and unnatural. With every step it took, the temperature dropped further, and the walls seemed to close in. Desperate, Sophia ran down the stairs, but the house seemed to shift, trapping her in endless hallways that led nowhere. The whispers were deafening now, coming from every direction. "Leave, or stay." As she reached the front door, it slammed shut with a force that shook the entire house. The voices became frantic, pleading, begging her to stay. She could feel them pulling at her, tugging her toward the walls. Panicked and desperate, she turned to her grandmother's journal, flipping through the pages until she found something that made her freeze. "To leave the house, you must sever the connection. Destroy the source of the whispers." The whispers had been tied to something in the walls, the very structure of the house. Sophia didn't know how, but she knew she had to act fast. She grabbed a crowbar from the basement and, with all the strength she could muster, she began tearing at the walls. The moment she broke through the plaster, the voices ceased. The air became still, the pressure lifted, and the temperature returned to normal. For the first time since arriving, the house felt empty, quiet, and almost peaceful. Sophia's hands shook as she collapsed to the floor, her heart still racing. She had broken the curse, but the house had left its mark on her. The whispers were gone, but the memories would never fade. And as she left the house for good, she couldn't shake the feeling that the spirits were still watching, waiting for the next soul to fall prey to the forest of echoes, or the walls of whispers. Some places, once haunted, never truly let go.